Hey guys, the casualty numbers I gave for the Soviets during the Second Kotlin offensive in the previous episode were incorrect. Rather than take the video down though, I thought I'd let you know at the start of this video instead, and asked you to see my Stalingrad addendum video which addresses the issue, link in the description. With that out of the way, let's get back to the action in Stalingrad. Overnight, on the 18th to 19th of September 1942, the blocking detachment of the 13th Guards Rifle Division, with some engineers and heavy machine guns attached, conducted a bank run. In the darkness, they crept up to the State Bank building, hoping to catch the German garrison by surprise. But the Germans spotted them and opened up, so the Soviets fired back and managed to suppress the Germans with a hail of automatic rifle and machine gun fire. Soviet engineers set their charges, and the explosion tore half the building down and silenced the garrison. This gave the blocking detachment the opportunity to storm the bank, and with grenades and small arms fire, they wiped out a dozen or so Germans and retook half the building. They didn't hold on for very long though, as the Germans counterattacked, and after a 6-hour fight, the guardsmen were overwhelmed and the ruins of the State Bank were in German hands again. As this was happening, new reinforcements were arriving from across the Volga. These were the 90th and 161st Rifle Regiments of Gorishny's 95th Rifle Division, which had been given the order from Chuikov, passed down from Yeremenko, to launch an attack from Mamayev-Kurgan to the west. This was to support the Second Kotlin offensive going on to the north, in conjunction with an attack by Shumilov's 64th Army to the south. The problem was that the order had assumed that Mamayev-Kurgan was in Soviet hands. It was not. The hill remained contested at best. Worse, the exhausted 112th Rifle Division's 416th Regiment was ordered to hold its line rather than participate in the attack, and the 137th Tank Brigade's 10 T-60 light tanks and a couple of hundred so-called dismounted tank troops weren't going to be of much use. Some of the KVs from 133rd Tank Brigade were officially subordinated to the 137th to support the attack, but none of them could be pulled out of the line near the two ravines. So 10 light tanks it was. There was also zero time to prepare for the attack, and the 95th Rifle Division's troops were inexperienced, so the results were predictable. At noon, the attack went in. Or, at least, attempted to do so. In fact, the Germans had spotted the Soviet build-up, and their artillery pounded the riflemen in their jumping-off positions before the attack had even begun, causing them a lot of wounded. We suffered heavy losses from bombs, shells and mortar rounds despite the almost continuous work of our machine guns. At times, it seemed to us that the Germans could not be defeated. The hill, Mamayev-Kurgan, almost on all its slopes and the top, was densely covered with corpses. In some places, in order to lie on the ground, one had to move 2 or 3 bodies. They quickly began to decompose, emitting a horrible odour. But we had no choice. We had to ignore this problem and lie down in order to occupy suitable positions. And this is no exaggeration. There were worse accounts than this. Some I probably can't repeat on YouTube. The men were stressed out and took to downing their vodka rations to relieve the stress. Because of the high daily losses, there was a discrepancy between the amount of vodka issued and the number of men able to receive it, and it was always possible to get more. There were some guys downing half a litre a day. They just wanted all the stress to go away. But drinking that amount was always fatal. You lost your sense of danger and the ability to fight properly. It also wasn't just the Soviets who seemed to have taken to the bottle. Most of the German soldiers appeared to be drunk and threw themselves in a frenzy at the summit. The spirit of the men aside, the German artillery completely disorganized the Soviet assault forces, and it took several hours to rally them. Only one attack went in later in the day, and it was beaten back by the Germans. Irseyev makes a compelling argument that Gorishny lied to the higher-ups, claiming that his division had attacked when in reality it really hadn't. But even if it had, Mamayev-Kurgan remained contested, with the Germans still holding the water cisterns at the end of the day. To the north, 23rd Tank Corps may have made some progress, taking a hill in the area, but was swarmed by Stukas who stopped them in their tracks. Overall, Churikov's attack had barely gone anywhere, which was also the case with Shumilov's forces to the south, and neither helped distract the Germans in the Kotlebane region. To the south, in the area of the two ravines, 112th Rifle Division's Southern Regiment did make some progress, taking part of the railroad embankment. In addition, the 3 kV tanks that had rolled through German lines on the 18th were now assisting 13th Guards Rifle Division's troops against the 295th Reconnaissance Battalion and supporting units. They pushed south into the buildings north of 9th of January Square, and the Railroad Bureau fell into their hands. The heist of the State Bank also seems to have unhinged the German line, as 2nd Battalion from the 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment pushed into the area behind the houses of specialists, taking many more buildings in the process. Some say that they did reach 1st Battalion's lines, others say they didn't. Either way, this placed the elements of Hinderlang's 1st Battalion in the houses of specialist area in a precarious position, being almost or fully surrounded. At the Zaritsa Balka, Zarayev ordered a 58-man unit from the 272nd NKVD Regiment to recapture the Astrakhan Bridge. Supported by another team from the 270th Regiment, this unit charged the German positions early in the morning, engaged their opponents in hand-to-hand combat, and managed to seize the northern end of the bridge. But at 0700 hours, German artillery and mortars compelled them to abandon the area once again. Then the 191st and 211th Infantry Regiments launched their own attack, aiming to secure the area north of the Zaritsa Balka. Battling all day, the 191st Infantry Regiment made some progress, pushing through the area north of the city gardens and reached the fallen fighters' square. But the 211th Infantry Regiment was suppressed by fire coming from foxholes dug into the city gardens, as well as the buildings south of there, which, despite their best efforts, remained in Soviet hands. South of the Zaritsa, 94th Infantry Division advanced house by house towards the Volga. At the same time, elements of the 29th Motorized Division moved north to help 94th Infantry Division deal with Dubyansky's forces. This combined assault forced the Soviets back, and they took the area east of the grain elevator, cutting the Soviet garrison off from the outside world. However, a small group of headquarters staff led by Commissar Belarusky from 10th Rifle Brigade did manage to break into the elevator to reinforce the garrison. And even though the Germans continued to shell the building, and even though they assaulted it several times throughout the 19th of September, they were unable to take it. North of the city, the second Kotlebane offensive continued to fail, because even though they successfully retook the important hill 154.2 from the Germans, they lost it again after a counterattack by 60th Motorized Division. This was perhaps why Stalin instructed Zhukov to move the attack to another area, because this one wasn't working. So Zhukov and Yeremenko quickly drew up a new plan to shift 1st Guards Army's axis of attack to the west in the area along both banks of the Kotlebane Balka. Yeremenko insisted that Moskalenka maintain pressure against the Germans at 564th Kilometer Station for now, and while he was doing this, he would receive several new divisions taken from 4th Tank and 21st Armies. Moskalenka was then told to begin the new phase of his offensive on the 23rd of September. So the Soviets would just be killing time until then. And as the 20th rolled in, the Soviets maintained the pressure, and Churikov realised that there was now no point in trying to distract or draw German forces away from the north. But he was under orders to attack, so with no choice, he ordered his forces onto the offensive once again. The 269th Regiment of the 10th NKVD Rifle Division was sent to reinforce the 9th Motorized Rifle and the 189th Tank Brigades of 23rd Tank Corps, but even with this support, they didn't get very far. The fighting raged on Mamiev Kurgan, with the Germans launching their own assault on the hill. Gorishny's 3rd Regiment, the 241st, had just managed to cross the Volga and could reinforce the Soviets there, but Chuikov instead ordered it to a defensive position at the Bani Ravine. Thus, the attack on Mamiev Kurgan continued to be a stalemate and nothing other than a bloodbath.
There were many wounded, some of who came off the battlefield without any means of carriage. They brought in the body of Ivan Vasilovich Rudnev, commander of the 161st Regiment. We heard the continuous whistles of bullets and the rattling of machine guns. When our men went into hand-to-hand combat, the cries of "Ura" rang out. Everything was on fire all around us.
112th Rifle Division's 2 southern regiments went nowhere within their ravines, and as the chaos within the city centre continued, the Soviets once again tried to retake the bridge across the Tsaritsa. They weren't able to do anything though, as German shells and mortar bombs compelled them to keep their heads down. Then the 211th Infantry Regiment of the 71st Infantry Division inched forwards through the gardens and the theatre area. They placed Rodimtsev's headquarters under fire, killing some of 62nd Army's runners who were sent to deliver messages to the guardsmen. Dragon's men, still holding onto the nail factory and nearby areas, saw the Germans regrouping and preparing to launch another attack. They readied their anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails, but the attack didn't come. Then, a local woman called Maria Vadanaya crossed through the German lines to warn Dragon that the Germans were indeed preparing for a tank attack. Kolganov wrote a now infamous note to his battalion commander Fedosiev saying that they were almost surrounded and that, while he was still alive, Fritz would have no success. The vermin shall not pass. South of the Tsaritsa, the 92nd Naval Rifle Brigade successfully held against the 94th Infantry Division, allowing the various formations around Dubyansky to flee to the north. Just to note, Chuikov had ordered them to withdraw, so this wasn't a violation of Order 227. That said, because the 267th and 276th Infantry Regiments had moved forwards, the 101st Regiment of Dubyansky's division was surrounded and was unable or unwilling to retreat. They would stay there as Dubyansky's main forces moved to the Volga. At this point, the central landing stage was a disaster zone. Wounded weren't being picked up, and there weren't any doctors, so local women were having to tend to the wounded as best they could. In the confusion of the night, ammunition had been unloaded on the shore, but it hadn't been collected and distributed. It just lay on the bank and was hit by the artillery and mortar fire that blasted the area, destroying a lot of it. In fact, this wasn't the first time this had happened. 13th Guards Rifle Division's supplies had been blown up on the 18th as well in the same fashion. Chuikov had to order his units to move the ammunition further inland or hide them in grooves in the ground so as to prevent this happening again. Chuikov gives hints of this in his book. Small units ferried across during the night to the right bank had to be deployed and established in position straight away during the night, and supplies had to be distributed to the troops, otherwise they would have been bombed and destroyed. We had neither horses nor trucks on the right bank of the Volga, as there were nowhere to hide them from bullets, bombs and shells. Everything that was brought across the Volga, therefore, had to be distributed to the troops' positions on the shoulders of our men. During the day, they fought off fierce enemy assaults, and at night, without sleep and rest, they had to carry ammunition, provisions and engineering equipment. The result was exhaustion and, of course, lower fighting efficiency. This went on not for a day or a week, but as long as the fighting lasted. And, according to one report, today the chief in charge of the crossing burned to death during a fire on the bank at the berth in Stalingrad. The report continues. During 19th to 21st September, blocking detachments detained 184 men, of whom 21 were shot, including 7 for spying, 5 as traitors to the motherland, 2 for self-mutilation, 6 for cowardice and panic, and 1 for desertion. 40 men were arrested. On the other side of the wire this day, the Germans started to evacuate the women and children from the city. There was already no food and little water, and many of those evacuated wouldn't survive the journey to the slave labour camps of the Reich. More on this grim fact later in the series. Also withdrawing from the south was the 24th Panzer Division. With the situation deteriorating around Mamayev-Kurgan, Seydlitz ordered Lenski to move north and take over 295th Infantry Division's sector to the west of Mamayev-Kurgan so that Wuttmann could shift his entire division to and concentrate against the burial mound. 24th Panzer Division therefore moved north throughout the 20th, and that evening the men of the grain elevator were almost out of ammunition and their water supply was used up. According to Kasyanov, the garrison now decided to break out towards Bigitovka. Supposedly Kasyanov reached the Volga, drank the ice-cold water, and then fainted. When he woke up, he was a prisoner of 14th Panzer Division or the Romanians. There's conflicting accounts. The problem is that William Hoffman's diary says that the Soviet resistance at the elevator only broke on the 22nd of September, not the 20th or 21st. 6th Army's diary notes that the elevator was still in enemy hands on the 21st, and it says that part of the elevator was taken on the 22nd, capturing 84 prisoners. So both Hoffman's account and 6th Army's diary confirms that Kasyanov wasn't telling the truth. Is this Kasyanov admitting that he abandoned the garrison and ran away like a coward? Or is it further confirmation that Kasyanov wasn't actually at the elevator? Igor Kobyakov sent me an email via Anton Jolly explaining that Kasyanov was definitely at the elevator because other witnesses said he was there. Kobyakov says that Kasyanov most likely, mistakenly, got the date of the breakout attempt wrong while he was recalling the events. Now, this is probably true. However, he did get the date wrong, and as we've seen, Kasyanov's account is flawed in many ways, so this makes me question whether he was recalling the events accurately or not. It could just be faulty memory, or he could be putting some sort of spin on it, but either way, his recollection of events is contradictory to several other accounts, like the German accounts. So the question is Kasyanov a trustworthy source? Not sure, but we're going to remove Kasyanov from the picture and say that, for now, the garrison at the elevator, just like the rest of Churykov's army, continued to hold on. Churikov saw how the 95th Rifle Division hadn't been enough to turn the tide on Mamayev-Kurgan. Even with a whole new division, the hill remained contested, and so if he wanted to take it, then he would need even more troops in the area. Luckily, he had just received Batyuk's 284th Rifle Division, which now prepared to cross the Volga overnight on the 20th to 21st of September, with orders to launch another attack against the hill. And since Churikov was sending reinforcements into the city, it's clear that if Paulus also didn't get reinforcements, then the tide of battle would turn in favour of the Soviets. Luckily for the Germans, Colonel General Dimitrescu, commander of the 3rd Romanian Army, visited 6th Army's headquarters to speak with Paulus. They discussed the takeover of Romanian forces on the Don front as more divisions arrived in the area. This would relieve the 113th Infantry Division, which was about to be sent east, and had already relieved the 100th Jaeger Division, which now reached the Rashoshka River area. 6th Army's command now finally accepted that further attacks in Stalingrad were impossible unless they sent the 100th Jaeger Division into the city. In Stalingrad, because of stubborn enemy resistance, the advance has stalled. The strength of infantry has been quickly depleted in heavy street fighting. Further attack is impossible without reinforcement by new troops from the west. The next day, the army group reports that 100th Jaeger Division is sent to participate in the battles in Stalingrad. It should be noted that the army group, meaning von Weichs, was clearly involved in the idea to reinforce Stalingrad, so this wasn't Paulus's decision alone. Yet, the German official history says it wasn't either of them. Hitler's reaction, the transfer of 100th Jaeger Division from the Sirotinskaya area to Stalingrad, held back at the former place only a day previously, illustrates a dilemma typical of the German conduct of operations ever since Directive No. 45. Well, it was Paulus and von Weich's decision to transfer 100th Jaeger Division to Stalingrad, not Hitler's. So if Hitler got involved, clearly Paulus and Weichs were in agreement, not in opposition. It then goes on. The almost complete lack of reserve divisions left the command no other option than to plug one hole by tearing open another. While it is true that Führer Order No. 45 caused problems, the way that the German official history describes the situation here is clearly false. Rather than tearing open holes in the line, the Axis were moving an entire army to the Don. The 3rd Romanian Army was relieving German divisions and allowing them to move east. So this wasn't a case of a complete lack of reserve divisions and tearing holes in the line. They were moving an entire army into the area. Yes, they weren't German divisions, but this move freed up 2 German divisions, both of which were moved east, one to Stalingrad, one to the Kotlebane area. Thus, it is wrong to say that they were tearing open holes in the line or that there were no reserve divisions. It's also wrong to only blame Hitler for placing Romanian troops on the Don, since Halder and von Weichs were clearly involved in this decision as well. More on this later. So, the official German history really gives the wrong impression here in its quest to blame Hitler and keep von Weichs and Halder out of the spotlight. Anyway, on the 21st of September 1942, in the centre of the city, some of the Soviet units reached the railway line. But a German Kampfgruppe, supposedly with 20 tanks, based on Soviet accounts, but more likely 14 Stugs, pushed the 2nd Battalion of the 34th Regiment back. They re-established contact with German forces in the Houses of Specialists before being halted by substantial counterattacks. The Soviet 2nd Battalion was reduced to a handful of men, so the resistance mainly came from the 45mm anti-tank guns of 4th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The spotters were in the buildings above the guns, pointing out where the German vehicles were. School Building No. 6 became a battleground again, with 2 Stugs assaulting it, while another Stug reached the brewery, where it was set alight by Molotov cocktails thrown from inside. As this was happening, German artillery pounded Dragon's men in the nail factory area. Then a 2nd Kampfgruppe of 150 infantry and 9 Stugs attacked, although Soviet accounts say it was 10 Stugs. The pressure was overwhelming, 1st Battalion was surrounded, then split in 2. Dragon assumed command of one pocket, while Fedosiev commanded the other. The Germans had cut us off from our neighbours. The supply of ammunition had been cut off. Every bullet was worth its weight in gold. I gave the order to economise on ammunition, to collect the cartridge pouches of the dead and all captured weapons. Just to note, the reason I say that the number of Stugs is lower than the Soviet accounts is partly because the Soviets were guessing at the number, but also because we know that the 244th and 245th Sturmgeschütz battalions only had 9 and 14 operational vehicles at this time. Therefore, assuming they moved all their Stugs into the area, which is certainly possible, it's more likely that it was 9 and 14 Stugs, not 10 and 20. Then again, the rest of the tanks could have been half-tracks, so there may have been 10 and 20 vehicles, just not all tanks or assault guns. Taking advantage of the momentum, the 194th Infantry Regiment moved into the buildings south of the Houses of Specialists. They took the Palace of Culture, which is this building here. Then they set up this PaK-38 anti-tank gun outside the Palace of Culture, which they camouflaged with various bits of debris. From this building and nearby areas, they were now able to shell and machine gun the boats coming across the Volga and also prevent the Soviets from sending troops along the riverbank. 62nd Army was therefore cut in two, and it was at this point that Chuikov lost communication with his forces south of this area. At the same time, the 276th Infantry Regiment moved east down the Zaritsa Balka, pushing Soviet forces back, and almost reached the Volga. From two directions, the Germans were now able to cover the mouth of the Zaritsa and the central landing stage with machine gun fire, adding to the chaos there. After a heavy artillery and Stuka attack, the 29th Motorized Division advanced, with the 267th Infantry Regiment marching with them. They reached the tram depot area, at which point stubborn resistance and flanking fire from the Volga slowed them down. The remaining 70 men of the 101st Regiment of 35th Guards Rifled Division continued to hold on in encirclement. But then a messenger from Dubyansky arrived, ordering them to break out towards the Zaritsa. Gerashimov and the other leaders of the regiment, including the Commissar, discussed whether they should try to sneak their way out. I rejected the idea of having the staffs leave in groups. That would be the end of whatever fighting strength we still had. We decided to fight our way out, using the element of surprise to underpin our plan of action. Having instructed the men, Gerashimov placed a machine gunner on his left flank and ordered the men to crawl forwards. As they did so, the Germans opened up with machine guns and mortars, pinning them down, but Gerashimov and his commissar rallied the men, leading them around a burning rail car and charged at the German positions. There were 15 or so Germans in a large crater, about 30 meters away. I threw a grenade, then a second. You could hear them howling, crying. When I ran forward, all the soldiers and staff members ran after me. Everyone got tangled up together, us and the Germans, and we were fighting hand to hand. Luckily for Gerashimov, the Germans ran out of ammunition, and so they were overpowered. Several more positions were tackled over a period of about 40 minutes before they broke through to their own lines. Only a few survived this suicidal charge. Both the regimental commander and commissar were severely wounded in this action. Despite brave actions like this, Soviet troops in Stalingrad wouldn't be able to hold out for too much longer without reinforcements. This was why it was important for Batyuk's 284th Rifle Division to cross the Volga now. Therefore, the 1043rd Regiment started to cross the river as the other two regiments prepared to follow it later. At Mamayev-Kurgan, the 90th and 161st Regiments of 95th Rifle Division and the 416th Regiment of 112th Rifle Division assaulted and captured the northern slope of the hill, pushing the German units in the area back from there. But heavy German fire caused horrific casualties in the Soviet ranks, as this account from a Soviet nurse makes clear.
They carried in a wounded soldier whose entire face was bandaged. The nurse carefully removed the dressing, and we saw a wide, lacerated wound that encompassed the entire upper portion of his face, where his eyes and upper portion of his nose had been. We stood there and looked at him, and could not summon the strength to work the wound, or even look away from it. Suddenly the wounded soldier asked,
"Doctor, will I be able to see?"
What response do you give a person who, at age 18, will be blind for the rest of his life and never see anything again? What could I say? I gathered up all my strength and said, "One of your eyes will not see, and the second, I don't know. In order to not cause any harm, we will send you to a special hospital." I could not tell him the truth. Let them tell him later, when they had the time to prepare him for what someone more artful might say. I did not have the strength for this.
This was when the bulk of 24th Panzer Division arrived in the Mamayev-Kurgan area. From the division's engineer and anti-tank battalions, it formed Kampfgruppe Salza, which moved to the division's left wing. The 26th Grenadier Regiment positioned itself in the area west of the airfield, and the 4th Motorcycle Battalion moved up to the side of 518th Regiment on the crest of Mamayev-Kurgan itself. The remainder of the division, with fewer than 10 operational panzers at this time, was placed in reserve, where they began to repair their vehicles. The division received some replacements from Germany, it's not clear how many, but Jason DeMark, in his book Death of the Leaping Horseman, says that these had little time to get used to the conditions at the front before they were in action again, and these few replacements wouldn't make up for the losses that the Germans had taken up to now. In fact, the casualty numbers are staggering, as we're about to find out. At the end of Paulus's first assault on Stalingrad, both sides were bleeding heavily. Between the 11th and 20th of September, Seilitz's 51st Army Corps had lost a total of 2,849 men. It's worth noting that some of these were lightly wounded and would stay with the troops, but even still, it's a lot of casualties. 29th Motorised Division reported on the 15th of September that they had over 4,000 vacancies within the division. By mid-September, they had taken 5,898 casualties in the previous 11 weeks of combat, and were also down to just 9 operational panzers, 2 of them being Panzer IIs. The 24th Panzer Division had suffered 1,714 casualties between the 27th of August and the 19th of September. 359 of these were killed, and 882 of these men were only lightly wounded and would continue to fight. They had, therefore, only taken 832 permanent losses, but even still it's clear that they were suffering. The 94th Infantry Division had lost 1,597 men between the 25th of August and the 22nd of September. Using Maclean's numbers to compare with Seilitz's corps, the number of casualties for the 3 divisions of 48th Panzer Corps fighting in the city, so not including 14th Panzer Division, comes to 2,588 men lost between the 11th and 20th of September. Overall losses in 6th Army's divisions for the period of the 21st of July, so the beginning of the battle, to the 31st of August, not including 22nd Panzer Division or the 48th Panzer Corps, comes to 38,553 men. By the 9th of September, these 6 army divisions were short by a total of 52,899 men. That's basically 3 divisions. Glantz says that from the initial 80,000 men and 100 tanks and assault guns on the 13th of September in Paulus's attacking force on the city, so 51st Army and 48th Panzer Corps, just 65,000 men and less than 25 tanks remained on the 26th of September. He also notes that no more than 40,000 of these were actual combat troops. The Soviets had also lost a substantial number of men, with tens of thousands having been killed in the Kotlebane offensives alone. In fact, if they lost roughly 80,000 men in the first Kotlebane offensive and another 88,000 in the second, to the 30th of September, then in total for the first and second Kotlebane offensives, they lost 168,000 men, which is more than all the German losses sustained in Army Group B alone from July to mid-November 1942. 156,265 men. I don't have statistics for the total number of men killed on the Soviet side for this period, and it's beyond my ability to calculate them, but it was substantially higher than the Germans, which is why Soviet divisions in the 62nd Army were mere shadows of their former selves. By this point, 35th Guards Rifle Division was down to less than 150 men, and the 10th Rifle Brigade had about 200 men. Glantz says that Chuikov had lost 69 of his original 100 tanks. Of the original 54,000 men in the 62nd Army prior to the city fight, 51,000 men remained. But that was only because the Soviets had sent in 40,000 replacements. This suggests that Chuikov had lost 43,000 men between the 13th and 26th of September. If this is the case, and I'm not sure if it is, but it could be, then the Germans had lost between 7,000 and 15,000 men so far fighting in the city, while the Soviets had lost 43,000. That's a ratio of roughly 3 or 6 to 1 for the city fight. Regardless of the actual number though, it's clear that the Germans were inflicting more losses on the Soviets. And, on the surface at least, it appears that the Germans have a major advantage at this time when it comes to manpower. Looking at the broad numbers for both armies, 62nd Army had a total of 51,000 men at this time, while the 6th Army had roughly 65,000 men facing Stalingrad, although some still say 80,000 men. To break it down even further, Zajlitz's 51st Army Corps had 30,500 men, with 9,500 in each of the 71st and 389th Infantry Divisions, and 10,500 men in the 295th Infantry Division. It's worth noting that a typical German infantry division at this time should have had 17,700 men, so they were massively under strength now. Kemp's 48th Panzer Corps had 40,000 men, with 15,000 in 24th Panzer Division, including attached units, 11,000 in 29th Motorized Division, and 14,000 in 94th Infantry Division. And Huber's 14th Panzer Corps had 31,500 men, although not all of them were facing the city. Anton Jolly says only about 9,500 men of this corps faced the city, bringing the total facing the city to 80,000 men. It's important to note though that Glanz says the number was actually 65,000 men at this time, and Anton Jolly lists 73,000 in his Stalingrad Battle Atlas, so 80,000 is probably too high. And either way, this was their ration strength, not the number of soldiers within each division. For example, 24th Panzer Division had a total ration strength of 15,143 on the 21st of September 1942. This includes several attached battalions that were subordinated to the division. But the combat strength, meaning the soldiers fighting on the front line, was just 8,536 men. Therefore, when trying to assess why the Germans were struggling against Soviet forces weaker than they were, we have to consider that not all the men in the divisions were fighting on the front line. If we take apart the 71st Infantry Division, Igor Kobiakov says that its 3 regiments had about 450 soldiers in each. This is a total of 1,334 men, not 9,500. Yes, we can add to this a few more hundred men from their motorcycle and engineer battalions, their artillery regiment, and there may have been some attached battalions fighting with them, like was the case with the 24th Panzer Division, but even so, the number of soldiers in the 71st Infantry Division was more like 3,500 men, maybe 4,000, not 9,500. If we use the combat versus ration strengths of 24th Panzer and 71st Infantry Divisions as a guide for the rest of the divisions, it paints a very telling story. The 389th Infantry Division had the same ration strength as 71st Infantry Division, which was 9,500 men. But based on the combat strength numbers for 71st Infantry Division, the 389th also probably had just 3,500 soldiers. The 295th Infantry Division had 10,500 men in total, but even if we assume that the extra 1,000 men in that division were all soldiers, this would only be 4,500 soldiers. So, while Zajlitz's 51st Army Corps had a ration strength of 30,500 men, the amount of soldiers fighting on the front line was probably around 11,500, roughly speaking. Maybe they had a little bit more because of the other attached units. Kemp's 48th Panzer Corps was slightly stronger at 40,000 men, but again, if we apply the same ratio of ration strength to actual soldiers, Kempf had less than 20,000 frontline combat-capable soldiers in his 3 divisions. Of the units in 14th Panzer Corps facing Stalingrad, instead of 9,500, it was probably more like 3,000 for the same reason. So, in terms of combat strength, the 6th Army had about 35,000 soldiers facing Churikov's 62nd Army inside the city. This is interesting because Glanz says that fewer than 40,000 men in the 6th Army were combat soldiers at this time, which is similar to the number that we've just calculated. Therefore, as a rough guide, Paulus only had somewhere between 35 and 40,000 soldiers committed to the city fight at this time. I can't calculate an accurate combat strength number for Churikov's army, but from its ration strength of 51,500 men, I'm going to broadly guesstimate it had about 22,000 bayonets, meaning combat soldiers. I say this because on the 18th of September, the 244th Rifle Division had 765 men in total, but only 195 of these were classed as bayonets, so there were 570 non-combatants in the division. In a similar fashion, the 385th Rifle Regiment of 112th Rifle Division had a total of 314 men on the 21st of September, but a combat strength of 141 men. By the 22nd, before being reinforced, the 13th Guards Rifle Division's 3 regiments were down to a total combat strength of 481 men, even though its ration strength was considerably higher. The point of this is to say that rather than 130,000 men fighting for both sides in the city, in reality it was more like 60,000. And if you consider the size of the battle area, it's no wonder that the fight had boiled down into small skirmishes between small numbers of soldiers. This is why Glantz says that after Paulus's first offensive into the city, most of the fighting was done by small groups of less than 50 men, and it was these groups that struggled to take and hold individual buildings or areas. He also says that for most of the combat, and certainly the combat in the centre of the city, the operational maps on both sides were incorrect. They showed coherent divisions roaming about the place, but in reality, it didn't look like that. Instead, men from different units often rallied behind a leader or rallied to the defence of a certain location. Therefore, in a lot of ways, the units we've been following on the map are perhaps more intermingled than presented, and should be seen as a rough guideline only. It's also worth considering that this devolution of the fighting into small groups of soldiers is what would allow Chuikov and others to come up with small-scale tactics and strategies to overcome their opponents. Had the fighting continued to be fought in large formations as it had out on the steppe, then it's probable that such tactics wouldn't have been as applicable. The same applies with the concept of snipers. Against a division, a couple of snipers is nothing more than a nuisance, but when you have less than 50 men, every man counts, and a sniper can do a lot of damage to a small group of soldiers. The combat strength numbers for the Germans are confirmed when we study the battalion strengths of the 6 divisions from 48th Panzer and 51st Army Corps fighting in the city. Rather than 9 infantry battalions per division, the 71st, 94th and 295th Infantry Divisions had 7 infantry battalions, and the 389th had just 6. Bearing in mind that both the 71st and 389th Infantry Divisions had had 9 battalions on the 31st of August. And in the case of the 71st Infantry, 2 of these had been at medium strength, meaning that they had had over 400 men in each. 24th Panzer Division should have had 4 Panzer Grenadier battalions and had 4. The 29th Motorised should have had 6 and had 6, but look at the strengths. The Germans rated just 12 of their battalions as average in strength, meaning that they had between 200 and 300 men only. 9 were spent, 12 more were weak, 100 to 200 men, and 4 were exhausted, meaning they had less than 100 men in them. Their engineer battalions were mostly spent, although the motorcycle battalions from the mobile units were still strong at this time, so they had more than 400 men in them. Even though the 94th Infantry Division was probably doing the best out of all of these divisions, it was still 2 battalions lower than it should have been. And overall, Zeilitz's 51st Army Corps was especially weak at this time, which explains why it was having so much trouble advancing in the centre of the city compared to Kemp's 48th Panzer Corps, which was able to secure the south. This is why, on the 20th of September, Zeilitz reported that his 3 infantry divisions were so depleted and exhausted at this point that they were all only fit for defence, meaning that they shouldn't be used in attack. Even the Sturmgeschütz battalions attached to Seilitz's 51st Army Corps were suffering. On the 19th of September, the 244th Battalion had 12 Stugs in repair, leaving them with just 9 operational Stugs. 245th Battalion had 17 in repair and 14 operational, and it wasn't just men and vehicles they were losing too. In the Corps, 600 horses have been lost over the past 10 days, mainly due to night bombing. In short, while Paulus may still have had a manpower and material advantage over Chuikov at this time, the 6th Army was rapidly becoming exhausted. This is perhaps why he didn't want to wait outside the city, as some have suggested he should have done, but instead decided to strike quickly to try and seize it. He had to win before his own army was depleted, or before Soviet reinforcements turned up. This becomes apparent when we consider that Chuikov had received 40,000 replacements between the 13th and 26th of September, and had Chuikov not received them, he would have had about 11,000 men right now rather than 51,000, and it's clear that the city would have fallen quicker than even Halder had hoped. The timely arrival of Radimtsev's 13th Guards Rifle Division ensured that Chuikov could continue to conduct a viable defence in the city at a time when it appeared his army would simply erode away and collapse outright. It also began a process that would continue throughout September and October, and at the most critical times, feed fresh flesh and blood into the Stalingrad meat grinder. Even with these reinforcements, Chuikov was in trouble. The Soviet units in the south totaled perhaps no more than 1,000 men on the 17th of September. They had been reinforced with the 92nd Rifle Brigade, and Glantz says that the forces south of the Zaritsa Balka had 5,000 men at most on the 19th of September. I'm actually surprised that the 94th Infantry Division, which had around 14,000 men on the 20th of September, was struggling against them, especially when there were 2 other divisions in the area, 24th Panzer with 8,000 men and 29th Motorized with 11,000. Sure, German forces were depleted, but why couldn't they take out a Soviet force that they clearly outnumbered and were vastly superior in strength against? Well, I think there is actually a reason for this, but we'll come back to discuss it in the future. For now, what's important to note is that if Paulus wants to take the city, he has to do it now before his army loses the last of its strength. This was why it was vital for 3rd Romanian Army to move to the Don, freeing up 2 German divisions, and why Paulus needed to send in the 100th Jaeger Division as soon as possible. The question is, would this be enough? Would one more division turn the tide of battle in Paulus's favour? We'll find out soon. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.